Preface. The nature of Japanese militarism. The new history of Japan is the history of continuous wars. War and aggression were the basis on which monarchist capitalist Japan existed and developed. The respite between the wars was extremely short-lived. Moreover, they served to eliminate the consequences of the past war and prepare for the next. And just as the addict must gradually increase the dose of the drug, so the scale of the wars waged by the monarchist capitalist Japan each time took on a wider scope, until, finally, it unleashed a war against all of humanity, which led to a terrible disaster. But despite this, now, 8 years after a complete defeat in the Second World War, militarism is reviving rapidly again. Why, then, over the course of the life of 3 generations of the Japanese were forced to constantly fight? Maybe this is due to some national characteristics of the Japanese. This is, of course, not because the Japanese as a nation are warlike. The Japanese people, like the working people of the whole world, love the world, have always demanded peace and demand it now. None of the wars waged by Japan in recent times have enjoyed the support of the people. The people always hated aggressive wars and always opposed them. But this movement of the people was suppressed by the ruling classes and could not affect the policy of the state. But does this mean that for Japan, wars were fatally inevitable? It is often said, Japan has a small territory, it is poor in minerals, and overpopulated. Therefore, the Japanese as a nation, in order to ensure their existence, had no other way but to capture new territories and sources of raw materials. This theory appeared before the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. However, even after Japan invaded Taiwan as a result of the Sino-Japanese War and practically turned Korea into its colony, it not only did not give up wars, but, on the contrary, used these factors to prepare for even larger wars. As the occupied territory and spheres of influence of Japan expanded, the theory of the overpopulation of the country more and more persistently propagated. After the First World War, this theory was especially widespread. Precisely to this period is the following conversation between Prime Minister Haruki and the genre Yamagata Aritomo. Yamagata proves that our country has a territory sufficient for its population, that it is necessary to encourage a system of small land tenure. It may seem strange that similar thoughts have been expressed recently by me, but the fact is that I completely agree with Yamagata. It is beneficial for us to convince foreigners that, due to the overpopulation of the country, the Japanese must emigrate abroad, and we need to obtain the consent of foreign powers. In fact, the percentage of population growth in our country is very doubtful, and its territory is quite sufficient for the resettlement of the population within the country, and there is no reason to worry about overpopulation. In fact, when we have recently achieved some growth in industry, we are faced with a shortage of manpower. Both Yamagata and Hara are the leading political figures of modern Japan. They knew better than anyone else the real situation in the country. Therefore, although Yamagata and Hara propagated the theory of overpopulation of Japan among the Japanese people and peoples of the whole world, they themselves admitted that in reality this propaganda was aimed at easing aggression against foreign states. Other propagandists of the theory of overpopulation pursued the same propaganda goals, which appeared in the political arena after Kara and Yamagata. Why, then, is the new and latest history of Japan, a history of wars and aggressions. Japan was dominated by the monarchy, the semi-feudal system of landlord tenure, and the inextricably linked monopoly capital that enjoyed special privileges. And it was they who in their interest threw Japan from one war to another. 1. The transformation of Japan from a country oppressed into a country oppressing. Japanese-Chinese and Japanese-Russian wars. The transformation of Japan into a modern country and its transition to capitalism were accomplished through the Meiji Reformation. The guiding force of this process was the monarchy. Using the spontaneous anti-feudal struggle of peasants and townspeople aggravated at the beginning of the 19th century uprisings, riots, as well as the outrage of all sectors of society by the policies of European states in America, which began to oppress Japan at that time, and discontent with the shogunate, who were unable to confront this policy. Reformist samurai, landlords and traders overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate, daimyo robbed and samurai land, destroyed their power over the people, and created a unified state led by the emperor, the absolute monarch. 1868 to 1871 years. Since 1873, the country began to implement agrarian reform, which was called the revision of the land tax system. This reform affirmed the right of personal ownership of the land and replaced the natural quitrent levied on the basis of the size of the crop with a monetary tax calculated in accordance with the value of the land. However, as a result of the reform, the peasants did not receive land freed from the feudal burden. Although the quitrent was replaced by a tax, the state actually squeezed from the peasants the same amounts that they had previously paid to the feudal lord. The wastelands and mountain forests that were not personally owned passed from the hands of village communities to state ownership. The reform approved a system of land ownership by landowners who used the forced labor of peasants and exploited tenants. In fact, she did not improve the situation of farmers in the least. Tenants, as before, gave the landlord in kind in the form of rent more than 50% of the harvest and were still in serfdom. Medium and small peasants, who had their own land, were subjected to brutal exploitation as a result of a land tax in money and in the end were forced to part with their land. So, in 1890, 68% of the peasants had to fully or partially rent land. In agriculture, feudal landed estates dominated. The landowner in the village was the emperor, that particle from the sum of which the monarchy in Japan was formed. As a result of the land tax, they were brutally exploited and were eventually forced to part with their land. So, in 1890, 68% of the peasants had to fully or partially rent land. In agriculture, feudal landed estates dominated. The landowner in the village was the emperor, that particle from the sum of which the monarchy in Japan was formed. As a result of the land tax, they were brutally exploited and were eventually forced to part with their land. So, in 1890, 68% of the peasants had to fully or partially rent land. In agriculture, feudal landed estates dominated. The landowner in the village was the emperor, that particle from the sum of which the monarchy in Japan was formed. Capitalist industry was created under the monarchical system in order to equip the army with the modern weaponry and police, the most important mechanism that ensured the power of the monarchy. Such old and new trading houses as Mitsui, Sumitomo, Mitsubishi and others, having established a close relationship with the bureaucracy, had become creators of politics. They received huge privileges and, along with state capitalism, occupied key positions in trade, transport, finance, and mining. From the second half of the 80s of the last century, these trading houses already stood at the head of large-scale modern industry. And here they seized a monopoly position from the very beginning. The capital that nurtured capitalism, in which these trading houses occupied a dominant position, was obtained from the land tax. The peasantry itself, suffering under the conditions of the landlord system, was an inexhaustible source of cheap labor for Japanese capitalism. Employed workers were forced to work in unbearably difficult conditions for scanty wages, undergoing incredible exploitation. On this basis, Japanese capitalism developed. Both in terms of capital accumulation and in terms of labor, Japanese capitalism was directly and indirectly associated with the semi-feudal landlord system. The capitalists and landowners supported the monarchy, and the monarchy, in turn, united them. The monarchy ruthlessly suppressed the slightest resistance of the peasants and workers and defended the interests of the landowners and capitalists. The forces of the people were constrained by feudal relations, and this made it impossible to achieve independence from foreign powers in a democratic, revolutionary way. From the very beginning, the monarchy made the country dependent on European states in America, seeking to compensate for this with political and economic aggression in Korea and China. What a disdain for national dignity was concluded in these actions of the monarchy. From the very first days of its existence, modern Japan was confronted with the need to free itself 14 from the oppression of the capitalist powers of Europe, as well as America, which imposed unequal treaties on it. The monarchy used this as a very convenient excuse for the comprehensive strengthening of the army and police and for the propaganda of militarism. The ruling classes could not but know, at least in theory, that in order to achieve independence, it is first necessary to resolve the issue of democratizing the country. But they feared democracy more than foreign oppression. They created a military and police apparatus that persecuted the people, who insisted on a democratic revolution. They used this apparatus for aggression against their weak neighbors, deceived the people who demanded independence from foreign states, and sought only to maximize the satisfaction of their interests. Thus, militarism has become the essence of the monarchy from the very moment of its inception. Immediately after the formation of the Meiji government in Japan, the doctrine of submission to Korea became widespread. In 1874, an invasion of Taiwan was carried out. In 1875, the Korean island of Kenhuado was captured. A year later, Japan forced Korea to sign an unequal treaty. The following years were characterized by more and more Japanese intervention in Korea's internal affairs and aggression against it. But such an aggressive policy was carried out only when a European state or America supported or at least agreed with its actions, which can be proved by the example of any aggression of the Japanese military. So, the invasion of Taiwan was planned and prepared under the direct supervision of the United States. The penetration of Korea after the capture of the island of Kenhuado began thanks to the promotion of England. However, the revision of treaties with England, America and other countries ran into resistance from them. And only at the end of the 80s, when the Anglo-Russian contradictions in the Far East escalated and England decided to turn Japan into its puppet in the struggle against Russia, Japan managed to revise these treaties. As soon as Japan began to create its capitalist industry, mainly textile, and launched the construction of railways, as in 1890 the crisis of overproduction broke out. This crisis with extreme clarity testified to a sharp narrowing of the domestic market, which was an inevitable consequence of the brutal exploitation of the people by the monarchist state and landowners, as well as the uneven development of industry due to the creation of privileged trading houses. As a result of the crop failures of 1889 to 1890, it turned out that semi-feudal agriculture did not have stable productive forces that would sufficiently provide developing capitalism with the necessary raw materials and food. To resolve this difficulty, the monarchy and the big bourgeoisie forced an external expansion. The attention of the ruling classes of Japan was drawn to Korea as a food base. Increasingly, demands began to be heard to increase penetration into the rich Chinese market and to achieve their equal privileges for Western countries for Japan. Japan's policy towards Korea became more aggressive every year. After 1882, the contradictions between Japan and Korea and its overlord, China, escalated especially, which resulted in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. The ruling classes of Japan could venture into this war only because they hoped that England, faced with the Japanese demand for a revision of the treaties, would support her in this war. In addition, England sought to prevent the intervention of Tsarist Russia in the foreign policy of Japan. Therefore, it is by no means accidental that 9 days after the signing of the agreement on the revision of the treaties concluded between Japan and England, Japanese ships unexpectedly attacked the Chinese squadron. Victory in the war brought Japan rich trophies. She received a huge cash contribution and territory. China was forever banished from Korea. Japan imposed an unequal treaty on China, giving it privileges that far exceeded those used in China by European countries and the United States. The war was a turning point in the history of Japan. From a country oppressed by European powers and America, it has turned into a state that oppresses other nations along with European countries and the United States. The monarchy directed the struggle of the Japanese people, who sought to completely free themselves from the oppression of European countries and the United States, to oppress the peoples of neighboring states. It was such a policy of the monarchy that led to the Sino-Japanese War. The closest connection exists between this policy and the one that Japanese imperialism subsequently pursued. As a result of the victory of Japan in the Sino-Japanese War, Japanese capitalism began to develop rapidly. Light industry was created. The formation of capitalism in Japan led to the fact that a small group of large privileged capitalists, such as Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Yasuda, Okura, Yoshikawa, Sabuzawa and others, managed to spread and strengthen their direct and indirect dominance in a number of sectors of the Japanese economy, in the field of finance, trade, transport, mining and heavy industry. This helped to strengthen their political position, but not to increase the well-being of the people. The development of capitalism was the reason that the question of the situation of the working people of the city, which before the war stood only as a question of the poor, turned into a working question. Contradictions between the working class and the class capitalists have become the main contradictions in the country. The strikes led by Katayama Sen, the trade union movement, the 1901 Declaration on the creation of the Social Democratic Party. All these were indicators of the growth of the class consciousness of the working class. The development of capitalism had a profound effect on the agriculture of Japan, but here this influence was expressed not in the destruction of the semi-feudal production relations prevailing in the countryside, but in the strengthening of the parasitic landowner system. Even those landowners who previously cultivated their land themselves became parasites. Large landowners, who began to invest in stocks and government loans, turned into industrial and commercial dealers. On the other hand, large capitalists, buying up huge tracts of land in mountain forests, became parasite landowners. Thus, the bond between large landowners and large capitalists was strengthened, and the number of landowners who did not live in the countryside grew. The contradictions between the parasite landlords and their tenants, hardly inferior in depth to the contradictions between the workers and capitalists, increasingly became the main class contradictions in Japan. The response of the imperial government and the bourgeois landlord parliament to the development of new class contradictions in the city and the village was the adoption in 1900 of the law on maintaining public peace by the police, which had abolished all human rights and all civil liberties, approved by both the government and parliament. This law was mainly aimed at suppressing labor conflicts in cities and the actions of tenants in the countryside. In the field of foreign policy, the old contradictions have also been replaced by new ones. Japan, which expelled China from Korea, faced a more powerful adversary there, Tsarist Russia. The Sino-Japanese War was for the great powers a signal of the beginning of the struggle for the division of China. The first concrete manifestation of this struggle was the intervention of the three powers in the Sino-Japanese conflict. Japan obeyed their requirements, but soon she managed to take revenge. Under the conditions of monarchy and expansionism, Japan could not win over European countries and America in the field of economic competition. The transition of Japan to imperialism would be impossible if the following three conditions did not exist, or if at least one of them were missing. 1. Of all the countries of East Asia, Japan possessed the greatest military force. 2. Japan used its advantageous political and geographical position. It is located away from the great European powers and America, and its closest neighbors were weak states. 3. As a result of the contradictions between the imperialist powers and for a number of other reasons, Japan received assistance from the largest imperialist states. The ruling classes were well aware of this. Japan took an active part in the punitive expedition of the allied forces of the imperialist powers, sent to suppress the Chinese people who rose to fight the uprising of the Yuan 1900, and proved that in the Far East it is the only country that can most quickly mobilize large armed forces. At this time, Japan, finding a weak spot in the position of the great powers, decided to seize the Chinese province of Fujian. Using Taiwan as her base, she hastily landed troops in the port of Amoy, located opposite this island. However, the shout of England forced her to give up from their plans. This happened because Japan neglected the third of the conditions mentioned above. The main of the three conditions mentioned was the monopoly of military force in the Far East. That is why the Japanese monarchy and the bourgeoisie, preparing for war, even before the conclusion of a peace treaty with China, directed all their efforts to the arms race. 90% of the indemnity received from China, amounting to 360 million yen, was used to cover military expenses. The budget of the War Ministry, which amounted to 73 million yen in 1896, increased in 1903 to 150 million, that is, more than doubled. Since national wealth was spent on unproductive military spending, the domestic Japanese market, already weak enough compared with the developing productive forces, narrowed even further. There was a shortage of industrial capital. Japan failed to turn Korea into a sales market, and there was only one way left to pursue a predatory policy there, and this caused increased resistance of the Korean people and an increase in pro-Russian sympathies among the Korean population. Therefore, Japan could not help but strive for war. And she gradually prepared for her, which in turn weakened her economic base. It was the existence of such interdependence that explained why, despite the seizure of ever-new territories and the receipt of indemnities, economic prosperity did not occur in Japan. In 1897, an economic crisis erupted. 3 years later, he repeated again, and another 3 years later a new depression swept the country. But even in the period between these crises, the general prosperity of the economy was not observed. This situation forced the bourgeoisie to seek overseas markets and demand that the monarchy expand aggression. The militarism of the monarchy and the expansionism of the capitalists developed, mutually complementing each other. On the other hand, Japan's economic weakness, pushing it toward aggression, as Prime Minister General Katsura admitted, made Japan's sole influence on the situation in the Far East difficult. She faced the need to conclude a certain agreement with one of the European powers, Katsura. So, in 1902 the Anglo-Japanese Union was created. Japan, which was one of the oppressed countries of the Far East, or, more precisely because it was such a country, was forced to remain dependent on a particular imperialist state. Japan's dependence, on the one hand, and its aggressiveness, on the other, also manifested itself in the Japanese economy. Complaining about the lack of capital, Japan nevertheless intensively exported capital to China and Korea for military purposes. It monopolized the day mines in China, built railways in Korea, etc. As a result, there was a lack of capital inside the country. The Japanese government and the capitalists saw the only way out of this situation in the import of foreign capital. Actually, Japan launched the war against Russia only thanks to the financial assistance of England and the United States. Of the 1,720 million yen spent by Japan on this war, 800 million were foreign loans. Thus, the Japanese-Russian War of 1904 to 1905 was unleashed as a result of the merger of the imperialist demands of the bourgeoisie and the militaristic aspirations of the monarchy, and was fought with the help of U.S. English imperialism, mainly English. This war revealed the imperialist character of modern Japan. But at the same time, that period was characterized by the birth of the first anti-war movement in Japanese history, the main force of which was the working class. This movement was led by Katayama Sen, Kotoku Shusui, Sakai Toshihiko and others. Of particular great historical significance was the fact that, as a result of the Japanese-Russian War, the peoples of Russia and Japan recognized the need for solidarity in the struggle for peace. The active anti-war struggle of the socialists inspired Yutamura Kanzo, Isano Aquino, and all those who longed for peace and hated war.